Mason Wilder never imagined a simple piece of paper could upend his peaceful life. Yet there it was, taped crudely to his rusty gate. A neon orange notice, stamped "Final Warning" in bold letters that seemed to glare at him under the morning sun. His heart sank as he read the words. "You are hereby ordered to mow and maintain the pasture behind your home within 7 days. Failure to comply will result in fines up to $1,000 per week." Mason's jaw tightened. The sprawling 3-acre pasture behind his modest home was more than just grass to him. It was a carefully nurtured sanctuary. Over the years, wildflowers had bloomed in riotous colors. Native grasses swayed in the breeze, and bees and butterflies thrived amid the untamed beauty. This was his refuge from the manicured rows of cookie-cutter lawns in the neighboring HOA subdivision. The Homeowners Association's letter was a stark reminder of the battle brewing between his desire for freedom and their strict rules. Mason had deliberately bought the property on the edge of the HOA's jurisdiction, thinking he could live outside their reach. Apparently, that had changed. He pulled the letter off the gate and studied it carefully. The HOA claimed the pasture was a fire hazard and an eyesore that attracted pests. They demanded he restore the lot to community standards immediately. The phrase felt like a slap. Mason didn't belong to their community, but somehow, their rules still clawed at his land. Inside his study, Mason paced, running his hands through his graying hair. He knew mowing meant losing the fragile ecosystem he'd fostered, but ignoring the notice could bring escalating fines. Or worse, legal action. He had to act. But how? An idea struck him suddenly. A better idea. The next morning, Mason fetched a stack of lumber from his shed and built a large wooden sign, weathered but sturdy. In bold black letters, he painted, under scientific study, Federal Observation Zone, do not disturb. He planted it firmly at the edge of his pasture, visible from the road and the HOA homes beyond. It wasn't just a sign. It was a challenge. Within hours, neighbors stopped by, some curious, others skeptical. One woman from the HOA's board stopped her SUV and glared at the sign. Mason waved calmly, eyes twinkling with quiet defiance. What they didn't know was that Mason had set up small trail cameras and motion sensors hidden among the wildflowers, quietly recording any unauthorized activity on his property. The past week had taught him to expect trouble. That night, as darkness blanketed the pasture, the camera's infrared lens captured movement. A figure slipped silently through the tall grasses, a glint of metal in their hand. Mason leaned closer to his laptop screen, heart pounding. The image sharpened. Someone was clipping his prized flowers, moving carefully but deliberately. His breath caught. He zoomed in. The figure's face was partially visible under the brim of a hat, but it was unmistakable. Karen Delaney, the HOA board member. She had crossed the boundary. Mason shut the laptop slowly, a mix of anger and satisfaction swelling inside him. The war was no longer just about a letter or a sign. It was personal. Tomorrow he would confront Karen at the HOA meeting, and he would make sure everyone understood that his pasture was not just grass waiting to be mowed. It was a living, breathing ecosystem, and he was ready to fight for it. As the wind whispered through the wildflowers, Mason smiled. They wanted him to mow his pasture. He had a better idea. The HOA meeting room was cramped and buzzing with hushed conversations as Mason Wilder stepped inside, clutching his laptop like a shield. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow. On the polished conference table, Mason's eyes immediately found Karen Delaney, seated near the front, her sharp gaze slicing through the chatter like a blade. Karen was known for her no-nonsense attitude. A former county planner who had risen swiftly through the HOA ranks. To Mason, she was the spearhead of the campaign against his wild pasture, the woman who had likely signed off on that fiery ultimatum taped to his gate. He took a deep breath and waited for his turn to speak. When the chairperson called his name, Mason rose and began, voice steady but firm. "I want to show you all something." He connected his laptop to the projector and the room darkened. The screen flickered to life, displaying grainy but unmistakable footage. The camera showed a slender figure moving stealthily through the tall grass of Mason's pasture. The night vision image caught the gleam of scissors and the careful clipping of wildflowers. The figure paused, lifted the hat to reveal a familiar face, Karen Delaney. A ripple of murmurs filled the room. Karen's eyes narrowed. "That's circumstantial at best," she said sharply. "Anyone could have been in your pasture." Mason held up a hand. "That was last week, Karen. And I have the timestamps." He played more footage. Karen photographing his bee boxes, kneeling to examine flowers, even pocketing a few specimens. The video was clear. She had been trespassing. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I was conducting an official inspection on behalf of the HOA," she insisted. "You are in violation of community standards." Mason shook his head. "I never agreed to be part of this HOA. And this is not just grass. It's a carefully preserved habitat for native species. I'm protecting endangered butterflies and bees." Karen scoffed. "That's just an excuse to let your property go wild and become a fire hazard." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. The HOA's insurance provider had warned about liabilities. If Mason's pasture caught fire, the entire neighborhood could be at risk. Just then, Mason pulled out a letter from his folder and waved it for all to see. "This letter is from the county fire marshal," he said. "It acknowledges my property's status as a low-risk zone because of the native plant species, which retain moisture and reduce fire hazards. This contradicts the HOA's claims." Karen snatched the letter and skimmed it quickly. Her scowl deepening. "That's irrelevant. The HOA has its own standards." Mason's eyes met hers, unyielding. "Standards that don't apply to me, Karen." The meeting adjourned with no resolution, but Mason's message was clear. He wasn't backing down. Later that evening, Mason's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. They bribed the inspector. "You're not wrong, but there." Playing dirty. Mason stared at the screen. A chill ran down his spine. Who was watching? And how deep did the HOA's corruption run? The next morning, Mason found his pasture's sign, vandalized, slashed, and bent. Someone had cut through the wildflowers at the sign's base. He knelt down, brushing the broken petals from his fingers. This was no ordinary neighborhood dispute anymore. It had become a battle of wills, and Mason was determined to win. As he looked up at the sky, he whispered, "Bring it on." Mason Wilder sat at his cluttered kitchen table, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee as he scrolled through emails. After the heated HOA meeting and the chilling anonymous text, he knew he needed help. The stakes were higher than he'd imagined, and his backyard war was quickly turning into a legal and environmental battle. That's when the message popped up, a reply from Dr. Elena Ruiz, a state ecologist Mason had met years ago at a conservation event. She was known for her no-nonsense approach and fierce advocacy for native species. Elena's work had been featured in national journals, and she had ties to journalists who could amplify Mason's cause. Mason didn't hesitate. He typed back, explaining the situation in detail, attaching photos, and the trail cam footage of Karen Delaney's trespassing. Within hours, Elena responded with a surprising offer. She would come to his property tomorrow and conduct a formal ecological survey. Then, next day, Eleanor arrived with a backpack full of scientific equipment, her dark eyes sharp and curious. She moved through the pasture with reverence, kneeling to examine clusters of wildflowers, carefully noting the hum of bees around the hives Mason had installed. "This is a rare find," she said, her voice low but urgent. "Monarch butterflies use this kind of habitat for breeding. And these native bees? Many species are endangered, and your land is a critical refuge." Mason felt a flicker of hope. Elena pulled out a small handheld device and measured the moisture levels in the soil, then sampled leaves and grass stems. "If the HOA forces you to mow or spray pesticides, it would devastate this ecosystem," she warned. "I can help you file a protective environmental notice. It won't be easy, but it could halt their attempts legally." Mason nodded, determination hardening his features. Later that evening, Elena helped him draft a formal letter, addressed to the Department of Agriculture and the state's Environmental Protection Agency. The letter requested an immediate review of the pasture's ecological significance and warned that any interference could constitute an environmental violation. Mason posted the letter online as well, tagging local news outlets and environmental groups. The following days brought unexpected attention. Local reporters called, neighbors began asking questions, and online comments flooded in with support. The narrative was shifting. Mason wasn't just the stubborn neighbor ignoring HOA rules. He was a protector of nature, but the battle was far from over. One evening, Mason noticed an unfamiliar black SUV parked just across from his gate. The tinted windows reflected the streetlights, and two shadowy figures sat inside, motionless. Heart pounding, Mason peered through his window. To his horror, he recognized one figure as Dale Krieger, the HOA president, notorious for his aggressive tactics. The second was someone new, a burly man with a clipped beard and cold eyes. Mason didn't know who he was, but the atmosphere felt heavy with menace. Mason stepped back, suddenly aware that the fight was no longer just about grass and flowers. It was becoming a war of power, secrets, and hidden agendas. He locked all doors, glanced at the trail cams, and whispered to himself, "They're watching, but I'm ready." As night deepened, Mason realized this was only the beginning, and that the pasture he fought for was far more valuable than anyone had guessed. Mason's heart hammered in his chest as he trudged toward his bee boxes the next morning. The first soft rays of dawn painted the pasture gold, but what he saw stopped him cold. Frames shattered, honey spilled thick and sticky across the wooden slats and onto the wild grass beneath. The delicate hives, once buzzing with life, were eerily silent. Bees swarmed frantically, their home destroyed. Mason's jaw clenched. This wasn't the work of careless raccoons or stray animals. It was deliberate. He crouched and scanned the ground, eyes sharp for any clue. That's when he noticed it. A small shard of acrylic, jagged and glinting in the early light. He picked it up carefully. It was part of a false fingernail. Artificial, polished, manicured. His mind raced. Who among his neighbors or adversaries would wear nails like this? It was no coincidence. Mason knew he had to act fast. He called the sheriff's department, but they were unimpressed. "Without witnesses or prints, there's not much we can do," the deputy said dismissively. "Could be raccoons like you said," but Mason wasn't fooled. Determined to catch the culprit, he spent the afternoon setting up additional trail cameras, hidden this time in thicker brush, and motion sensors connected to a small recording device. He even installed a low-power spotlight that would trigger on movement after dark. That night, he paced inside his house, barely able to sleep. His eyes flicked constantly toward the security monitors. At 2:17 a.m., the sensors tripped. Mason scrambled to the monitors and watched breathlessly as a shadow slipped through the fence, moving deliberately toward the B-boxes. The faint glow of the spotlight illuminated the figure's hands as they worked quickly, smashing another high frame. Mason zoomed in on the face. It was Dale Krieger, the HOA president himself. Dale's expression was cold and focused. He wore thick gloves and carried a gas canister in one hand. Mason's stomach churned. What was Dale planning? Arson? Poisoning? Mason grabbed his phone and dialed the sheriff's non-emergency line. "You need to send someone out here. Now." Minutes later, the driveway crunch of tires echoed. 2 deputies stepped out cautiously. Mason pointed at the monitors. "Look. He's trespassing, damaging property. I need an arrest." The deputies exchanged glances. "We'll investigate," one said, though neither moved to detain Dale. Immediately, frustrated, Mason watched the screen as Dale disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind chaos in his wake. The next morning, Mason's pasture looked like a battlefield. Bees were missing, frames ruined. The scent of spilled honey hung thick in the air. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Rumors whispered of the HOA's desperate measures. Elena Ruiz called Mason later that day, voice grim. "This is escalating dangerously. If Dale's using gas canisters, that's a serious threat. We need to prepare for more sabotage, maybe even fire." Mason felt the weight of her words settle deep inside him. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the broken hive fragments and the small acrylic nail shard. Someone from the HOA was willing to destroy his sanctuary, risking lives and livelihoods to win this fight. But Mason Wilder wasn't done yet. He whispered fiercely, "Bring it on." The air felt thick with tension as Mason Wilder sat under the sprawling oak tree at the edge of his pasture, reviewing the protective measures he and Dr. Elena Ruiz had discussed. Fire had become a looming threat, no longer just a hypothetical risk, but an imminent danger. Mason's mind replayed Elena's warning. If Dale Krieger or someone from the HOA tries to set your pasture ablaze, it could spread quickly and devastate the whole neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on him. The HOA claimed he was a hazard, yet it was their president acting dangerously. Determined to get ahead, Mason had begun organizing a network of allies. He reached out to neighbors who were quietly sympathetic, environmental groups, even local firefighters. Many were skeptical at first, but Mason's evidence was undeniable. Trail cam footage, damaged hives, and an escalating pattern of sabotage. That evening, Mason met with Captain Sarah Green, the local fire chief, at the fire station. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they pored over maps of the neighborhood. "This pasture is unusual," Sarah admitted. "Native plants here retain moisture, which actually helps prevent fires. But if someone introduces accelerants..." Her voice dropped. Mason nodded grimly. "Exactly what I fear." Sarah leaned forward. "We can set up additional fire breaks around your property, and will increase patrols, especially at night. But you need to be vigilant too." Mason felt a flicker of relief. Meanwhile, word of the conflict reached local news stations. A reporter from the county newspaper called Mason for an interview, eager to tell the story of a homeowner battling his own HOA to save an endangered habitat. Mason agreed. hoping public pressure would force the HOA to back down. But then, as if to prove how high the stakes had risen, disaster struck. One night Mason was jolted awake by a distant roar. Through his bedroom window, he saw an ominous glow flickering in the darkness, the unmistakable color of fire. Heart pounding, Mason grabbed his flashlight and rushed outside. Smoke curled in the cool night air. Flames licked the edges of the pasture, hungrily devouring dry leaves near the fence line. He sprinted toward the blaze, shouting for help. Neighbors stirred awake, some grabbing hoses, others calling 911. Fire trucks soon arrived, sirens piercing the night. Mason watched helplessly as firefighters battled the flames. His pasture, his sanctuary, was under attack. Hours later, the fire was contained, but the damage was devastating. A third of the pasture lay blackened and charred, the native plants smoldering in ash. Mason stood at the edge, choking back tears. But amid the ruin, he noticed something odd, footprints leading away from the fire, toward the neighboring HOA properties. They were fresh. Someone had set the fire and walked away as if it was just another chore. The next morning, the HOA board issued a public statement blaming Mason for negligence, accusing him of ignoring fire safety warnings. Mason clenched his fists. He knew the truth. This was no accident. It was arson, and he intended to expose whoever was behind it. As he looked at the burned remains of his pasture, Mason whispered fiercely, "This fight isn't over." Not by a long shot. The morning after the fire, Mason Wilder sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at the charred remains of his pasture in the distance. His phone buzzed relentlessly, ringing off the hook with calls from reporters, neighbors, and even local officials. Yet none of it comforted him. The fire had changed everything. Before Mason could process the whirlwind, there was a sharp knock at the door. Two stern-faced men in suits stood on his porch. Investigators from the county fire marshal's office. "Mr. Wilder," one began, "we're here to talk about the fire last night. There are some serious concerns about your role in what happened." Mason blinked. "My role? I was the victim. Someone set my pasture on fire." The investigator's gaze was cold. "We have evidence suggesting otherwise. Witnesses report seeing you near the pasture just before the fire started. Also, the gas canisters found at the scene were registered to you." Mason's heart pounded. He knew those gas canisters. His bee smoker tools for the hives. He'd never used them for anything dangerous. It was obvious someone had planted them. "This is a setup," Mason said firmly. "I've been targeted for months by the HOA. I have proof of harassment and sabotage. This fire was arson, and I believe it was orchestrated by the HOA leadership." The investigators exchanged glances, unconvinced. The news broke that afternoon. Local homeowner under investigation for arson after pasture fire blared the headline on every channel. Mason's phone exploded with calls, some from sympathizers, many from skeptics, and a few outright hostile. He had become the villain overnight. Karen Delaney even posted on the HOA's website, insinuating Mason's negligence and reckless behavior. Feeling isolated but not defeated, Mason reached out to Elena Ruiz. Her voice was steady when she answered. "We need to clear your name," she said. "I'll help gather environmental impact reports and eyewitness testimonies. Plus, my contacts in the press can help tell the truth." Mason agreed. Days later, Eleanor surprised Mason with a crucial piece of evidence, a time-stamped video from a wildlife camera placed near the edge of the pasture. The footage showed two figures in the dead of night, one unmistakably Dale Krieger, approaching the pasture with suspicious containers. The other figure, Karen Delaney. The video captured Karen pulling out a device resembling a lighter, while Dale poured a liquid from one container onto the dry brush. The footage ended just before the fire ignited. Mason's blood ran cold. This was the proof he needed. Armed with the video, Mason confronted the HOA board at their next meeting. The room buzzed with tension as he played the footage on the projector. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Karen's face flushed red with anger, and Dale's expression twisted into something unreadable. Mason's voice rang out, clear and unwavering. This isn't just about a pasture or HOA rules anymore. This is about who we are as a community, and I won't stand for lies, intimidation, or violence. The board was forced to suspend both Karen and Dale, pending an investigation. As Mason walked out of the meeting, a neighbor approached him quietly. "You did good," she said. "But watch your back. They're not done yet." Mason smiled grimly. "Neither am I." The HOA's power had been shaken, but Mason Wilder knew better than to expect a peaceful resolution. With Karen Delaney and Dale Krieger suspended, the neighborhood was abuzz. But beneath the surface, the battle simmered dangerously. Mason prepared for the final phase of his fight, the showdown. He organized a community gathering in the local park, inviting neighbors, reporters, environmental experts, and HOA members. Flyers went out, social media posts buzzed with anticipation. This would be Mason's chance to expose the truth and push for lasting change. On the evening of the meeting, the park was filled with a restless crowd. Mason stood at the podium, flanked by Dr. Elena Ruiz and Captain Sarah Green. A projector screen was set up behind them, ready to display evidence. As Mason spoke, he recounted the months of harassment, the trespassing, the sabotage, the fire, and how the HOA's leadership had conspired to destroy his pasture. He shared the scientific importance of preserving the native habitat and the dangers of reckless HOA policies. Elena presented detailed ecological reports, emphasizing the pasture's critical role in sustaining endangered species. Sarah outlined fire safety plans and community measures that could prevent future disasters without resorting to destruction. The crowd listened intently, many nodding in agreement, but then a voice shouted from the back, "This is all a lie. Mason's just trying to stir up trouble." It was Karen Delaney, unrepentant and defiant, escorted by a few loyal HOA members. Tension spiked as Karen stepped forward, challenging Mason publicly. "You've endangered this community with your negligence. You refused to maintain your property and caused the fire yourself," she accused. Mason met her glare without hesitation. "The only negligence here is your abuse of power and willingness to break the law," he replied calmly. "We have proof, we have witnesses, and now so does everyone here." Suddenly a man in the crowd pushed forward, a longtime resident named Tom Jenkins, who had remained silent until now. "I've lived here for 20 years, Tom said, voice strong. "And I've seen how the HOA board has bullied anyone who doesn't agree. Mason is the only one standing up for what's right." The crowd murmured in support. Feeling the tide turning, Mason took a deep breath. This community deserves leadership that respects the land and the people. I'm calling for a special election to remove the corrupt HOA board and replace it with representatives who will listen. Cheers erupted. Karen, seeing the shift, turned and stormed off, her loyalists trailing behind. As the meeting concluded, neighbors approached Mason, offering help, apologies, and renewed hope. But amid the triumph, Mason noticed a shadow lingering near the edge of the crowd, a figure watching silently, face hidden beneath a hood. A chill ran down his spine. Even with the board's suspension, the fight wasn't over. Mason squared his shoulders and whispered, "Whatever comes next, I'm ready." The weeks following the community meeting were a whirlwind. The neighborhood was alive with chatter, debates, and signs of change. Mason Wilder felt a cautious hope stirring. But he knew better than to let his guard down. The special election was set, and candidates stepped forward to challenge the old guard of the HOA. Mason campaigned tirelessly, emphasizing transparency, respect for the environment, and community unity. On election night, neighbors gathered at the community center. The tension was thick, the outcome uncertain. When the results were announced, it was clear. Mason's coalition had won by a landslide. Karen Delaney and Dale Krieger were officially removed from the board. Cheers erupted, but Mason's victory was tempered by a lingering unease. Despite the win, strange things continued. Anonymous letters slipped under doors, warning him to stop stirring trouble. Late-night knocks echoed at his front door, but no one was there. Then one morning, Mason awoke to find a bright yellow notice taped to his mailbox. A formal warning from the HOA's new interim board, alleging unapproved use of community resources on his property and threatening fines. It was a reminder that while old faces were gone, the system's bureaucracy and resistance remained. But Mason was undeterred. He convened a meeting with the new board and community leaders, determined to rewrite the HOA's rules to protect homeowners and nature alike. The pasture slowly began to heal. Native plants returned, bees multiplied, and the monarch butterflies danced again in the wildflowers. Mason installed educational signs inviting neighbors to appreciate the ecosystem. One afternoon, as Mason walked the edge of his pasture, a neighbor approached, holding a small package. "It's from an anonymous admirer," she said with a grin. Inside was a thick envelope filled with old HOA records, revealing years of mismanagement and corruption. Mason's eyes widened. This was bigger than he thought. He realized the battle was just beginning. But this time, he had the community behind him, and the truth on his side. As he looked over the pasture, bathed in golden light, Mason felt a quiet peace. Then his phone buzzed. A new message appeared. "You're making waves. Watch your step." Mason smiled to himself. "Bring it on," he whispered. The pasture was safe for now. But the real war for justice had only just begun.